We'll continue the conversation on Naomi Osaka and her withdrawal from the French Open. It's obviously dominated sporting headlines over the past 24 hours. If you missed it earlier on this evening, the 4 Grand Slam tournaments released a joint statement. Certainly, you won't be surprised to hear a more conciliatory tone than the one on Sunday evening where they threatened expulsion and there was the fine. So they're saying things like, on behalf of the Grand Slams, we wish to offer Naomi Osaka our support and assistance in any way possible as she takes time away from the court. She's an exceptional athlete. We look forward to her return as soon as she deems appropriate. Mental health is a very challenging issue which deserves our utmost attention. It's both complex and personal, as what affects one individual does not necessarily affect another. We commend Naomi for sharing, in her own words, the pressures and anxieties she's feeling, and we empathise with the unique pressures tennis players may face. They did, though, hold their ground on the fairness point, which was one of the real kernels of their initial response to her initial statement, in that if she's not doing a press conference, she has an unfair advantage over her competitors. So they did reiterate that today. They said change should come through the lens of maintaining a fair playing field regardless of ranking or status. Sport requires rules and regulations to ensure that no player has an unfair advantage over another. We intend to work alongside the players, the tour, the media, the broader tennis community to create meaningful improvements. David Law is with us. He is the co-host of the Tennis Podcast. He's also a commentator with BBC 5 Live. Hi, David.
Hi there.
So quite a few days. It is ultimately just so awful that it had to end in Naomi Osaka feeling she had no choice but to withdraw from the tournament. It really shouldn't have got to that stage, I would put it to you, if we jump off from Wednesday's statement. Do we know when she initially released the statement on Wednesday, to what extent the French Tennis Federation were able to deal with her either face-to-face or have a chat with her via Zoom? Or what happened here? Because they certainly have talked about a lack of engagement on her side. Do we know how things were handled from the Wednesday statement?
My understanding is that everybody was completely blindsided by that statement. I don't think anybody within tennis, aside from those close to her, knew anything about it, from what I can gather. And I think that is part of the problem that has come and escalated from there. And I'm not saying that to point a finger at Naomi Osaka and saying you shouldn't have done. I must admit, when I read the initial statement, I was taken aback. I didn't really like some of the things that she was saying in it, although I sympathised with her, the struggles she was clearly experiencing, but I didn't particularly think it was fair if she wasn't going to do press conferences and everybody else was going to, because it is quite a long time. I disagreed with some of the points she was making about what the room is like, a press conference room. She cited some examples that are absolutely legitimate, but there are so many that are not like that. And actually, I think her interactions with us in the media have always been, by and large, very positive experiences. She seems to have enjoyed them. I mean, she's had some tough ones, but I also accept that she was going through a hell of a difficult time. And I think we understand that more now in hindsight, having heard and read her second statement. It's very difficult to make good decisions when you feel like that. And it's very difficult to necessarily kind of reach out to people like the French Tennis Federation or the tours and say, I'm feeling bad. When you are feeling that bad, it's not that easy to articulate that you need some help and that you're suffering. So what happened was I think she put that out, and then everybody, the whole thing took off. They took umbrage at it. They decided they needed to kind of stamp down on it, make a stand. And I think it just escalated out of control.
Yeah, it really did. And it got very muddled. I think you make a great point when you say it's unreasonable for us to expect a perfect handling of the situation on her part when she's going through a difficult time. Like she herself conceded on Monday, communication maybe could have been a touch better. And it did get muddled. Like initially in her statement when she talked about sitting in press conference and being asked multiple questions again and again, or questions that bring doubt into her minds, I'm just not going to subject myself to people that doubt me. And at the same time as well, her sister said that, you know, she's asked all the time. Her sister took to, I think it was Reddit, certainly it was a post somewhere which was widely circulated, and she said, you know, she's asked all the time about how she's bad on clay, and she starts to believe she's bad on clay. And so her solution is to block everything out, no talking to people who are going to put doubt in her mind. She's protecting her mind, hence it's called mental health. So many people are picking up on this term thinking you need to have depression or to have some sort of disorder to be able to use the term mental health. And then her coach on Monday morning, he said, this announcement is not about her personally. Naomi has the opportunity to use her status to address problems, to initiate things, and she wants to use that. So, like, the messaging there was initially a touch muddled, to say the least, and you could fairly deduce that she just found these questions a bit tiresome or a bit too negative in tone, and it's like, I'm not surrounding myself with that negativity, and so I'm out. And, you know, see, there was a degree of like, well, is that enough of a reason? However, when she cited mental health, you would have to say that the authorities should have approached that with far more caution. Okay, they may have been sitting there saying, they may have got the wrong end of the stick because the messaging was quite muddled. But once she talked about her mental health, I think at that point, for them to go public with statements, to threaten fines, to threaten expulsion, that really did not help. Like, I would put it to you, there was a real lack of compassion on their part in their public dealings. That's why I'm very curious about what was going on behind the scenes, because I'd put it to you this way. The tennis authorities were behaving like a body who were of the opinion, she's trivialising mental health, she just doesn't fancy doing the interviews, and she can afford to pay the fines, and so we're going to come out, you know, we're coming after her. That's why I'm asking about behind the scenes, because publicly, that was how I felt they were behaving, that was their understanding of the situation.
I suspect there's quite a lot more to it than that in the intervening time, aside from the fact that they were blindsided by the original statement.
Yeah.
I think thereafter they did try, or they certainly say they tried to get in touch with her, to try to discuss it, to find out what was going on, what they could do. Maybe they needed to try harder. Maybe they needed to take longer in order to find out and to talk to her, rather than, I think the issue with their statement was that it went from nothing to that, and that was sort of 100% full on. If you don't toe the line, this is what it could lead to. And I know why they were doing that. They were trying to make it clear to her and to all the other players that they view everybody the same. They want to treat people fairly. It's competition. I really do get that. But I think because they did that suddenly and publicly and full throttle, my immediate reaction was, that's a bit much. I think that's a bit much, to be honest. And we talked about it on the tennis podcast that night. We do these shows every night. So we've had 3 successive nights of talking about this issue. And, you know, we've had a hell of a lot of correspondence from listeners who, quite a few people disagree with what we were saying and take issue. It's such a complicated situation. But I mean, I said at the time on our podcast that I felt like, I'm concerned about this. Where'd you go from here? This is a standoff. They've issued her an ultimatum. I don't think she's going to come back and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I shouldn't have done that."
Yeah.
And look, the woman is struggling. She's suffering from, as she said, depression since that 2018 US Open final, and we've seen enough of her to see what she's made of, what sort of views and principles she has, and in all of her stand last year, wearing the masks at the US Open, in her protests against social injustices in the United States. And I did think at the time, I think she could pull out the tournament. I think she could go on strike, whatever. I don't know where this ends up. And it's sad that it's ended there, that the end result is that she's out of this tournament and that she is suffering. So, yeah, I think we all should be reflecting a little bit on things we've thought and said. I'm certainly thinking about some of the preconceptions that I've had, that because my view is it's part of the job, you know, and that because it's all I've ever known. I've only ever known tennis players needing to do press conferences. Why should anybody be any different? I understand if you had a terrible time and if you feel terrible, there are players who take the fine, but to preemptively announce you're going to take every fine, and I think that felt like a line in the sand and a different story. But I will definitely go away and have a think about all of that in the months to come. And I think a conversation does need to happen. I just don't know what the solution is, really.
Well, I was just going to say, I suspect the solution may not be one that the Grand Slam tournament organisers like, but I think now mandatory press conferences in these individual sports will be up for debate. And it is notable that in her subsequent statement on Monday, she talked about the press, and she, in some ways, was more favourable to the tennis press than the media at large have been over the last couple of days. Who've been, talking about how dreadful these press conferences are, because she said... she's an introvert. She says, the tennis press have always been kind to me. I want to apologise to all the cool journalists I may have hurt. I'm not a natural public speaker. I get huge waves of anxiety before I speak to the world's media. I get really nervous. I find it stressful. That's never going to go away. That's not really... She's not talking about the nature of the questions there. Now, maybe there are issues there which we should touch on as well, but her core problem is just the stress and the anxiety that this aspect of the job brings to her. Now... I think, unfortunately, I'm not comfortable, actually, as a viewer, sitting there watching Naomi Osaka have to sit in front of the press corps again at Wimbledon. I don't think she should have to. And I don't think the majority of people listening would think she should have to. And I think Wimbledon will have to get their heads around that very, very quickly, because why should she, really? She's doing enough to promote the sport. When she's talking about the huge waves of anxiety there before she speaks to the world media, really nervous, very stressful, and her mental health is an ongoing issue for her. I don't see how that works, David. I don't see how she has to talk to the press at Wimbledon.
Where do you draw that line, though? It would be one of the questions I would ask you, because I totally take your point, but the sport is fighting for oxygen against other sports. It isn't just her concert, her gig, where she just puts out things on Instagram and we just lap it up. It is a competition, and that's why it's different to an exhibition match. You want to know the truth. You want to know the real story of the twist in the match, the turn, the moment she double faulted, what was going through her head. You do want to know that as a viewer and a reader, and they're not going to give that to you if they are just putting out their own version of events on their own social media channels. And now, yes, she does do an awful lot to promote the sport. She's a huge star. I think she's wonderful. I love interviewing her. I think she's great fun. I think she's really interesting, and I feel like I learn a lot. But I think I've worked with the players in a different role as a communications manager on the tours in the past. And I used to say to players, yes, the questions can get repetitive. You can often have to answer the same things, but yes, you have to hit your forehand over and over again in practice, and that's boring as well. It's just it is part of the job. Now,
is the short answer to your question, where does it end? It may just end with that's the price you pay for the well-being of the athletes, that you don't get that insight from those who don't want to do it, and you hope that enough of the athletes find it relatively okay and understand it's good for the sport, and they're happy to chat to the media at certain points. Is that just ultimately where you get to? Because
possibly. I mean, I think football writers and broadcasters might tell you something different, because I've seen them standing in the mixed zones at football matches and watching entire teams walk past them and ignore them.
And it's still the most popular sport in the world. It's surviving just fine, and like 19,
but it's starting from a higher level.
Sure,
in terms of popularity.
I do take that point. 99% of press conferences are pretty dull, though. Like is the other actually? It's a less important point, but in terms of what it might mean for the sport, I genuinely don't think I've watched many tennis press conferences. Funny, the only ones I watch, and this says something about all of us, are the ones where there's like a contentious moment, and often the player there is under stress, and we might all start to feel differently about that, I guess.
I just think, what is your alternative way of enabling them to talk to your show, for you to hear from them? How are you going to hear from them?
I mean,
if you don't have one?
We ask them on, and they generally say no. Unfortunately, that's the reality. I guess you hope enough of the sports people are happy to do it still. They mightn't want to spend 45 minutes doing it, but 15 minutes after a match, yeah, sure, I'll come in. I guess you're hoping enough do. But the thing is, the mandatory aspect is going to get very tricky. Sorry.
This is pretty unprecedented. Yes, I've had players, one or two players, say to me, "No, I'm not coming in," when I've been the liaison person in my former job 20 years ago, And I understand it. You know, that's one thing, but the vast majority come in, and I think when access is actually falling to players, it is one way of getting to speak to them. But it does create a much bigger debate, and like I say, it does make me think, well, I am going to consider that preconception that I've always had, that this is just the way it is.
We were just making the point before you came on air. It had struck me, I suppose, that this is unusual. You used the word unprecedented there, in that often, I was using the example of quite often we have guests come in here and talk to us, and they'll be reflecting on a time in their career where they were suffering with mental health issues or depression, and how things went to pieces for them and they didn't reach out for help, and now their advice is, if you're going through something, to, you know, speak up. And it's time and time again that story is told, and they're talking as somebody who's come out the other end of it, you know, years later, generally. Whereas what we're seeing here, and it's an amazing example. Like it's awful she's going through this, but the way it's unfolded, the way it's captured headlines all over the world, is an example to people everywhere of somebody exercising self-care in real time. She's actually not letting things get to a point where she's in absolute crisis. She is preemptively striking here. She is managing herself, and in real time. Very difficult, you know, and that's why we should all be sympathetic to her, I think. And I can't remember that happening in such a public way before, and I would think for a lot of people it will be a real source of inspiration in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I think she's an extraordinary young woman, and I think a year ago she made a stand against the police brutality that she was witnessing in the United States, and she said, I'm not going to play a final that was scheduled to be played that day. It was the same day as, I think, the NBA players said, we're not going to play our matches. And the entire sport stopped for a day. And I think Naomi Osaka has that pretty unique ability to both, in this case, be suffering, and I feel terribly sorry for her that she's suffering, but also understanding that maybe she could do something with that suffering for good, that she could start the conversation that you and I are now having. I mean, if you think back, whilst I think that initial post had some poorly worded elements to it, it also made it clear that she was looking to try to start a conversation around this. And she's achieved that.
She sure has. And David, a last point, because you, co-hosted the tennis podcast and BBC 5 Live commentator, you're in the sport, you'd have a feel for the organisers and the authorities and Wimbledon. Tricky few days for them, blindsided, communication not great, but now they fully understand the problem. How likely is she to be told, well, Wimbledon and beyond, you don't have to do press conferences? Where are they on this, do you suspect?
That's a really good question. That's a great question, and I really don't know the answer to it. I mean, I don't think that they will be able to get away from the view that whatever they decide needs to be fair for all. And so if they make some adjustments, they need to be able to make those adjustments for all.
Yes.
So that would be a big move in itself, because you are effectively, as you said earlier, making post-match meetings with the media non-compulsory. And that's kind of a can of worms, and we don't exactly know where that would end up if they did that. So I really don't know where they're going to end up with this one. Rather them than me, to be honest. But I'm still glad that we're having to think about this, because it will be in the back of my mind when I'm phrasing questions. I'd like to think I would do so sensitively anyway.
Sure.
But it'll definitely make me think. And that's something she's achieved with this.
Okay. David Law, we're out of time, host of the tennis podcast. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.